I'm Harley Smith, and this is the Master Growers course. Today we're going to be looking at precision fertilizer management and a strategy of growing I call spoon feeding, when you give the plant exactly what it needs when it needs it, because the nutritional needs of the plant change at each stage of the plant's growth. By manipulating and controlling the nutrients, giving them exactly what they need when they need it, we can make the plant a little more vegetative. We can steer it to be a little more generative. I can increase rooting. I'll show you how to do that today. How to increase root production by 20% just by adding a small amount of nutrients at the right time. I'm also going to show you ways to improve quality, improve yield, how to improve the nutritional quality of food, improve the medicinal quality of medicines, by specifically giving them the nutrients in a form that they can use at the right stage of growth. So let's start by looking at some of the essential elements that plants need. Plants need 17 essential elements to grow and reproduce. 3 of them, you may remember, are free: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that come from carbon dioxide and water. The other 14 essential elements are minerals that come from decaying organic matter and from the soil or from hydroponic nutrient formulation. So either way, they need 14 essential mineral elements that we provide in the fertilizer. The essential elements are divided up into macro elements and into microelements. The macro elements are the elements plants need the most of: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. We provide those in the greatest amounts for the plant. The microelements are trace elements that plants only need a small amount of, sometimes even a fraction of a part per million, but they're still essential elements. Without even one of those elements, the plant will not be able to complete its life cycle. And some of those trace elements are iron, copper, manganese, zinc, chlorine, boron, molybdenum, and nickel. They're all essential to growth. Now, many of them are essential because they activate enzymes in the plant. Here's your genetics lesson for the day. 1 gene equals 1 enzyme. It's controlled by the genetic code. Enzymes are molecules that do the chemistry of life to grow and to reproduce. But some of those enzymes have to be turned on by a cofactor, usually one of the transition metals like iron, copper, manganese, or zinc. If it's turned on, one molecule could do over 1,000 chemical reactions per second inside the cell. But if it's turned off, it's doing 0 chemical reactions per second. So even these trace elements, even though they're in small amounts, can have a dramatic effect on quality and yield and the metabolism of the plant. So let's take a minute to look at some of the individual elements that plants need. The first mineral is nitrogen. During the first half of a plant's growth, the plant will assimilate about 80% of the nitrogen it needs for the whole life of the plant. That's why most grow formulas, either hydroponics or organics, are proportionally higher in nitrogen. Now, plants take up nitrogen in one of 2 forms: either the nitrate form of nitrogen or the ammonium form of nitrogen. In hydroponics, about 90% of the nitrogen is provided in the nitrate form, and no more than about 10% or so in the ammonium form. In soil, it's a little different. You can add a little bit more ammonium, a little less nitrate nitrogen, because there are microorganisms in the soil. Some of them convert ammonium nitrogen into nitrites, and other microorganisms change nitrites into nitrates, and then the plant takes them up. So in soil, we can add a little bit more ammonium compared to the nitrate form. The next nutrient we'll look at is phosphorus. Phosphorus is the energy element. It energizes rooting, it energizes flowering. It's part of the energy currency of the plant called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The energy of the plant is actually stored in the phosphate bonds. The phosphate bonds are built, storing energy. When the phosphate bonds are cleaved, it releases energy to energize the next chemical reaction in the chemistry of life. So phosphorus is very important for the energy budget of the plant. Now, one of the best times to spoon feed a little extra phosphorus is in the first 2 or 3 weeks. Phosphorus energizes the rooting process for better root strike, for better establishment of the plant. So most starter fertilizers have a little extra phosphorus in them. In my experiments in the lab, I've added a little extra monoammonium phosphate. In those first few weeks, I saw as much as 20% increase in root development at transplant. So if you want to change your grow formula into a starter fertilizer, add a very small amount of monoammonium phosphate, as little as a 1/16 of a teaspoon per gallon of water. Oh, by the way, the ammonium and monoammonium phosphate actually aids with the uptake of phosphorus by the plant. Now, if you're growing in soil, though, there's a little different strategy. If you're going to be doing all organic plant nutrition, if you're going to be using rock phosphate and bone meal, then it's very important, instead of adding extra phosphorus, inoculate the roots with mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungi infect the roots in a beneficial way, and then the mycelium grows in the root zone. As the fungus is growing from the roots into the root zone, it exudes organic acids and enzymes that unlock phosphorus from the soil, unlock phosphorus from organic matter, and feed it to the plant. So if you're growing with all organics, then it's definitely important to inoculate the roots with mycorrhizal fungi and even phosphorus-solubilizing bacteria. The phosphorus-solubilizing bacteria are synergistic. They'll hitch a ride on the mycorrhizal fungi as it's growing in the root zone, get to places it could never reach on its own, and then the bacteria swim in the soil solution to places the fungus can't reach. They'll unlock phosphorus from the soil, feed it to the fungus, and then the fungus feeds it to the roots. So that's the 2 different strategies you're going to use for phosphorus spoon feeding. In all organic nutrition, add the soil microbiology. Mineral nutrition, add the monoammonium phosphate or monopotassium phosphate to give the plants a good head start. Okay, next comes potassium. Potassium is the health element. It contributes to the quality of fruit and flowers more than any other element. And that's because potassium activates enzymes for carbohydrate metabolism, to make the sugars in photosynthesis, and also to unlock stored sugars so it can flow to the flowers and be stored in the fruit. In fact, during heavy fruit and flower production, plants can deplete potassium to deficient levels in just 2 or 3 days, and that will affect quality. If you get a potassium deficiency in tomatoes, you'll get watery fruit, low sugar content, poor shelf life. So it's very important to keep the potassium to nitrogen ratio high for optimum quality. As the plant's depleting potassium, we want to put it back in, normally in the form of potassium sulfate. Now, it's especially important if you're pushing your plants to add potassium supplements, if you're adding CO2, if you have intense light, if you're using bloom stimulants. So they're putting on more weight with fruit and flowers. Plants will deplete potassium even faster. In one of my trips to the Netherlands, I had the opportunity to take a side trip to one of the most prestigious research greenhouses in Europe. It was in Belgium, and they were doing some of the first trials on the organic bloom stimulants. Under those perfect conditions, perfect temperature and humidity, perfect nutrient balance, rock wool as a growing medium, they were able to grow 12-foot tall pepper plants, loaded with peppers. And according to the scientists, that was the genetic potential of the crop. Even 2% increase would be statistically significant. Well, halfway through the trials on the bloom stimulants, they were at 10% increase in yield and rising. And we'll talk more about the stimulants in the future classes. But while I was there, not only did I see the data for increased fruit and flower production, they also had data on the nutrient use by the plant. As the plant was putting on more weight with fruit and flowers, it was depleting potassium faster than any other element. So I asked the scientists, why don't you add more potassium? Won't potassium become the limiting factor and provide a hidden hunger to the plant and stall out the growth? They said, we can't do that. I said, why not? You're a research greenhouse. They said, because in a controlled experiment, you can only have one variable. If we added the bloom stimulants and potassium, someone could look at that report later on and say, oh, the reason you got more yield was because of the potassium. So they couldn't do that. But I can tell you, if you're pushing your plants, if you're using bloom stimulants, add a potassium supplement so that put back in what the plant took out. Keep the carbohydrates flowing so the plant can reach its true genetic potential. Okay, let's look at all the other essential elements for a minute. First of all, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We just talked about those. We want to watch the balance too, especially the potassium to nitrate balance. Nitrogen is a luxury element. The plant will use it whether it needs it or not. In other words, you give the plant more nitrogen than it needs, it'll assimilate it. But it takes 20 to 30% of the energy of photosynthesis just to assimilate the nitrates. It draws down some of the carbohydrates. So if you overdo it with nitrate nitrogen, you'll burn off the carbohydrates in top growth. You get big top growth, but there won't be extra sugars to send to the roots. So it increases the root top growth, but restricts the root growth. So we don't want to do that. We want balanced growth. If we overdo it with nitrate nitrogen, you'll get big cells, thin cell walls, but less stored carbohydrates in the roots. Now, phosphorus and potassium, on the other hand, are active transport. There has to be stored carbohydrates in the roots for the plants to take them up in adequate levels. So if you restrict the root growth and increase the top growth, you could delay or even prevent flowering. So one of the first things I'll say in spoon feeding is make sure that you don't over-fertilize your plants, especially with nitrogen. Try to keep it in the adequate zone, not the luxury zone. You give it more than it needs, the plant will assimilate it, but it won't be healthy growth. So the other side is to watch your potassium. If you start to get even the first stages of a potassium deficiency, the plants can develop a hidden hunger. They'll stall. Plants are growing great, they're putting on weight, they're starting to put on flowers and fill in. Next thing you know, nothing's happening. It could be a potassium deficiency. If you give it a little bit of spoon feeding of potassium, it'll spark carbohydrate metabolism. The sugars flow to the flowers, they'll start filling in again. So spoon feeding is critical, even before there's symptoms of a nutrient deficiency. Phosphorus is another one. If you overdo it with phosphorus, a phosphorus toxicity shows up as a zinc deficiency. And zinc is one of those critical trace elements that plants need. It activates enzymes that make the growth hormones for the new bud development, for the new root development. So you overdo it with phosphorus, and a lot of you growers are overdoing it with phosphorus more than the plant needs, then it could have a long-term effect on quality later on. Also, zinc is part of a special molecule. We'll talk about it more in biostimulants, but it's called the zinc finger transcription factor. 4 cysteine molecules attached to one zinc ion. It makes a special molecule that goes into the plant, attaches to a DNA, and turns on a series of genes that tells the plant, don't make more stems and leaves, make flowering parts. So if you overdo it with phosphorus and get a zinc deficiency, it could have a negative effect on the total production of the plant. So balance is the key between your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The next element we look at is calcium. And calcium is king. let's put it that way. When plants take up calcium ion, they react with pectic acid in the plant to make calcium pectate. That's the glue that glues the cell walls together. So if you get good calcium uptake, you'll get thicker stems, thicker cell walls, a stronger vascular system, so the plant can take up water and all of the other minerals more efficiently. And the more efficiently plants take up water and minerals, the more chemical reactions they can do, the higher the BRIX. You can grow high BRIX plants. Also, if you get more calcium uptake, the plant will be more resistant, naturally resistant, to powdery mildew and to fungi. So don't wait till you have the problem and try to cure it. Give the plant the right nutrition in the right levels. Another thing with calcium, calcium is a passive element. It's only taken up in the transpiration stream. So if the relative humidity is too high, the air is too wet, plants won't take up enough calcium. You can get a calcium deficiency even if there's plenty of calcium in the root zone. The third thing with calcium is a little bit of amino acids. We've talked about that from time to time. I did some of the initial research on amino acids for calcium uptake years ago, made some new discoveries. But two of the amino acids, glutamic acid and glycine, not only chelate calcium, not only keep it from locking up in the soil, but it also stimulates root cells to open calcium ion channels. So instead of one ion at a time of calcium going into the roots, 1,000 ions at a time flow into the plants, go up in the transpiration stream, strengthen the plant. So if you want to grow healthy, disease-resistant plants, make sure there's water-soluble calcium and that it's available to the plant. Next comes magnesium. Now, magnesium is the central element in chlorophyll. It's actually the magnesium that makes plants green. The chlorophyll is the molecule that harvests the energy of the sun and changes it into sugars. Now, magnesium also works in balance with the phosphorus. Remember I talked about ATP, the energy currency of the plant, where the energy is stored in the phosphate bonds? Well, magnesium activates enzymes that hold onto the ATP molecule in position so those bonds can be cleaved to release the energy that the plant needs to grow and reproduce. So when the energy needs of the plants are highest, that's when the magnesium needs of the plants are highest. So at transition between grow and bloom, maybe a little bit more magnesium would be helpful. Maybe during heavy flowering, when they're putting on a lot of weight. Toward the end is also a really good time to spoon feed a little bit of magnesium, because magnesium also activates enzymes for phloem loading, to load the sugars into the phloem so it can flow to the flowers and be stored in the fruit. So a lot of some of the expensive additives are high in the magnesium sulfate they use just in the last few weeks of production to aid with the finishing power of the plant. That being said, let's look at sulfur. Now, many years ago, 20 years ago, I did some of my very first experiments with hydroponics, and I created nutrient formulas that were missing one element only. So one with no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no potassium, so I could create nutrient deficiencies and see what they look like, so I could identify them better. Well, the surprise came when I was doing the zero sulfur experiments. The zero sulfate, the flowers were only 2 inches high with just a few sparse petals. On the control that had the sulfur in it at adequate levels, 12, 14-inch flowers loaded with petals. So I knew that sulfur contributed to the flowering process. Also, sulfur contributes to the aroma and the terpene development of the flowers. If you want the best aromas, the best flavors, the best flowering process, make sure you're adding your sulfur to the grow nutrients. Now, most grow nutrients have plenty of sulfur. But if you're going to add an additive, let's say you want to add potassium, the best way to add the potassium would be as potassium sulfate. The potassium is going to help with the flowering process. The sulfur is going to add the aromas. If you're going to add magnesium at the end, add it as magnesium sulfate for the same reason. Plants will tolerate quite a bit of sulfur without it being toxic to the plant. So if you want to spoon feed, you want to change one element only, the sulfate form is the best way to do that. Okay, next let's look at silicon. Now silicon isn't an essential element. It's a beneficial element. Some plants are silicon accumulators. Some are silicon neutral. Some actually reject silicon. But silica does work along with calcium to strengthen the stems and leaves, so it's beneficial. Also, it's a good insurance policy to add a little bit of silicon to your nutrient formula. If the plant's under attack, say by powdery mildew or mold, the plant will mobilize silica to the point of infection, crystallize the cells, and help prevent the disease from spreading. So I work with cucumber growers in Canada, 70 acres. The first thing they add to their water before any other nutrients is silicon. They add it because cucumbers are susceptible to powdery mildew and other fungi. So it's a good insurance policy. They add the silicon first to the water, then they add the nutrients with the calcium, then they add the nutrients with the phosphates and the sulfates until they have a full spectrum nutrient, and then adjust the pH. So silicon, beneficial, but not essential. Next come the trace elements, especially the transition metals, iron, copper, manganese, zinc. They turn on those crucial enzymes in the plant for cellular metabolism, also for activate plant protection agents in the plant. And iron is one of the keys. Now, iron is a limiting factor in soil. It locks up pretty easily with oxygen to make oxides of iron, rust. If it makes rust, the plant can't take it up. If we keep the pH in the right zone, it makes iron much more available. Now, in hydroponics, if the pH gets above 6.5, iron starts to become unavailable to the plant. We could put it in there, the plant can't use it. So that's why we adjust pH in hydroponics between 5.8 and 6.4. Now in soil, it's a little different. In soil, we can be a little bit closer to neutral pH because microorganisms that colonize the roots make organic acids and enzymes. They could lower the pH as much as 2 points compared to the bulk soil. So the microorganisms aid with the uptake of iron by the plant. Also, some microorganisms make a special molecule called a siderophore. That means iron carrier, one of the best chelators of iron in nature. By the way, if you don't know what a chelate is, chela means claw. So a chelate is an organic molecule that attaches to a mineral like a claw. It holds it tightly enough so it doesn't get locked up with other minerals, but loosely enough so it's available to the plant on demand. So some microorganisms make siderophores right on the surface of the roots to sequester iron and make it more available for their metabolism and also for the metabolism of the plant. So nature has a way of solving the iron problem. Now, iron is also critical because iron is a catalyst for chlorophyll production, the green pigment. So if we can get more iron uptake by the plant takes up iron, it makes chlorophyll. It makes more chlorophyll, it's going to harvest more light energy. Harvest more light energy, it makes more sugars. Some of those sugars are used for energy to grow and reproduce. Some are stored in the flowers and the fruit. That's quality. And some are leaked from the roots to feed the microorganisms that make iron available to the plant. It's a beautiful system working with nature. If we work with nature, there are positive side effects, many of which we've never even anticipated. Also, the manganese, the copper, the zinc, they can form complexes that turn on enzymes to protect the plant. Boron works along with calcium, helps with the sugar transport inside the plant. Molybdenum, used in very small amounts, just a fraction of a part per million. But without it, the plant won't grow because plants need a little bit of molybdenum to be able to process nitrogen. Isn't that ironic? Nitrogen, which is used in the most by the plant, needs molybdenum to be able to make it available and usable and change it into enzymes and amino acids and chlorophyll. So even a fraction of a part per million. In Australia, for example, some of the land is deficient in molybdenum. They used to be a wheat importing nation. But once they discovered that, at just a fraction of a part per million of molybdenum to the soil, they went from being a wheat importing nation to being a wheat exporting nation. So it's an essential element. It's just as important to the plant as any of the macro elements. Nickel, that's another trace element. When I started 20 years ago, nickel wasn't even recognized as an essential element because it's a contaminant in many of the other fertilizers. So there was enough there. But now we recognize nickel as an essential element. Again, nitrogen metabolism, but more for the microorganisms. It activates an enzyme called urease, which converts urea into ammonium nitrogen, with the form that plants take up. So it's very essential, especially for the microorganisms in the soil. So now we've looked at all of the essential elements necessary in a typical nutrient formulation. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation on nutrient formulation and essential elements. I hope to see you in a future class.